Sci-fi, fantasy, space opera. Sci-fi is an interesting genre, so is fantasy, and of course the natural progression, the space opera. But I often see a lot of difficulties in projects centering around these types of genre, much less ones that are mixing these three or just two of them together. Star Wars created a lot of the landscape we see today, and how filmmakers are to create their own unique and interesting sandbox to play in. And I love being swept up in a world and being fully immersed in an epic tale that just makes you go,
now this is pod racing.
And there's a lot of great sandboxes, but there's also a lot of
Mars needs moms.
not so great sandboxes. But we're not focusing on the negatives. While I do have plenty to say on those, I'd rather focus on some of the positives of the huge franchises like Star Wars, Dune, and of course, the reason for this video, Saga, and how they were able to be so successful and thrive in the space opera medium. For those that have never heard of Saga, it's written by Brian K. Vaughan and illustrated by Fiona Staples, and it's kind of like Star Wars, but if Gaspar Noé went back in time and became best friends with George Lucas instead of Spielberg. Misa Spike of the Punch Bowl! The story is set in the middle of this huge epic war between Landfall and Reef that goes across a multitude of planets. There's politicians, bounty hunters, and just the cutest guy you've ever seen. Our main protagonists, Marko and Elena, are a couple on two sides of these warring races that, against all odds, found love and had a baby together. While the author has always had this universe in mind, he brings up parenthood as the kicking off point for this series.
It's kind of a shitty time to launch something new because the economy is tanking and sort of people want sort of the characters they grew up with. And at the same time, my wife and I had been talking about having kids, and some of my sort of liberal, well-intentioned friends were like, how could you bring a kid into the world? It's an awful time. And I realized that making a comic and making a baby were kind of the same thing. And so I could combine these two, and it would be less boring if I set it in a crazy sci-fi fantasy universe. So it's not just anecdotes about diaper bags.
For the most part, I've been pretty averse to a lot of comics, specifically in the space opera genre, because it usually leads to a disconnect in the immersion that I'm able to experience in a world. Because if I'm being honest, I don't care about Gagglemungus and his mini adventures on the fifth moon of Zagsmere. Like, a lot of comics sound more like the ingredients on the back of a Gatorade bottle than they do characters. And Saga has me completely invested in its world and characters. I was able to rent all of the collections through my library, and I would eagerly await for them to arrive just so I could speed through the next edition. This immersiveness to this world feels largely due to a creator thinking about this space for a very long time in the brilliant illustrations from Fiona Staples. Additionally, there are very few, if any, that are able to blend both sci-fi and fantasy elements together as good as Saga is able to do.
Yeah, I guess, well, I was way more a science fiction nerd growing up, I guess. I'm not terribly well versed in, I haven't read Lord of the Rings, which is shameful, I know, but I liked science fiction more, and I found that there's sort of a subset of we nerds who fight with each other, like our Venn diagrams don't overlap between science fiction and fantasy, so I guess I thought it'd be interesting to sort of take one science fiction character and one fantasy character who should hate each other, and instead of murdering each other, they make a little science fiction fantasy baby.
And even on top of melding these two spaces together, there's this added gratuitousness that just feels so necessary for the story they're trying to tell. None of the violence or nudity feels like it's cheap or just there for the sake of being there. This is a gross world with a lot of characters just trying to figure out their way of making it out. Which of course goes into my favorite character, Marko. Quick disclaimer, this video has as little setup and character spoilers as I possibly could, as I want to ensure people don't know anything about this project going into it, so they have a very similar experience that I blindly had with Saga. So give it a chance, and you just might fall in love with it. Marko feels like such a juxtaposition for this grim world. He's a landfalling that has been shown war and violence for all of his life, but now wants to reject any acts of violence to live a life of passivity. And that's pretty punk rock in this universe, if you ask me. And of course, because they're always on the run from people chasing them in this story, it inevitably leads to these spurts of having to break this code, which makes the few moments of him having to break this code for the ones he loved that much more honorable and special in the series. I've always been big on mentor characters in stories, specifically those that want the best from the next generation to come. And Marko is just this charming and lovable father that just feels so natural. And hot take, dads are cool. They wear jorts, mow the lawn, and listen to Creed while doing it. What I love about this series is these characters aren't the typical Skywalkers and Atreides that we've seen in the past.
And I figured out that I didn't want to tell sort of a Star Wars adventure with sort of noble heroes fighting an empire. These are just sort of more people very much on the outskirts of the story who just want out of this never-ending galactic war.
They want no business in saving the universe. They just want to make it out of this situation alive. And on top of this, Marko and Elena are just such a believable couple. Some of the weaker entries in comics, I've had a lot of difficulty buying into relationships because they mostly just feel like the same handsome, brooding man with the lady with huge gazongas draped over him. But Saga works as a romance comic on top of all the genres already mentioned, largely because it doesn't feel like it's appealing to one group of people.
I started to realize that there was massive untapped potential there and that mainstream comics were ignoring, most of the population. That what we consider mainstream comics are actually very, very niche. They're for a very specific audience.
And yeah, it probably doesn't hurt. Marko's a very good-looking dude.
Don't be intimidated, Squidward. Try to imagine him in his underwear. Oh no, he's hot!
There's just sometimes in a project that there's a special spark that sells the likability and investment for a character. I think of Han Solo's introduction in Star Wars, the first fight with Spike Spiegel, Reba's intro song in Reba, and Morbius introducing the Matrix. But among that list, I have to include this panel from Saga that immediately had me invested into diving into this huge story to find out how Marko, Elena, and their child would navigate through this crazy world. Speaking of which, I can't wait to see where the series will go after a 3-year-long hiatus. I'm pretty excited because the last time I can remember getting a book or a comic on the first day release is The Last Olympian in the Percy Jackson series. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I can't wait to dive into the Saga community now that I'm caught up on the series and there's new stuff coming out. And I hope at least one person is going to try out the series from this video. Fingers crossed. Later, haters.
Stories, the hero gets lonely. Now's the time to show what you're made of.